Hi everybody, sorry for the little difficulty there. Thanks for joining us, and this will be a presentation on zebrafish husbandry, and what I hope to do is provide an overview of successful practices. We're going to jump right in with probably what I would say is the most important single aspect, and one of the things that I come back to time and time again when people do approach me with problems in their facility, and that's water quality. And really the bottom line here is to just keep it stable. You may hear that from other people, and I'm just going to echo the exact same sentiment. If you keep it stable, your fish will be happy. These zebrafish exhibit a wide range of tolerance to most of these water quality parameters that we can control in the lab, but stability is the goal. When accidents do happen, and they do happen, reverse them gradually. Just bear in mind that you've already put them into a state of stress by pushing some or multiple parameters out of their normal range, and really the goal is to not give them any more stress than really needed. So reverse it gradually. So what happens, let me give you an example. A dosing pump goofs up and suddenly your conductivity goes from 800 microsiemens to 2,000 microsiemens. It's absolutely not that big of a deal. You should be concerned about preventing it from happening again in the future. But the answer isn't to dump all the water and replenish with fresh or RO and to get the conductivity back down as quick as possible. Just let it come back down nice and slow using the typically the automated water exchange that's in these systems. So temperature and controlling of water quality. Temperature is one of the things that actually impacts virtually every water chemistry characteristic, and it does have a direct metabolic impact on the animals as well. So their range of tolerance is just massive, all the way down to 7 degrees Celsius and up to 42. And indeed, there are even heat shock protocols for adult fish that take them up to 42 degrees for a number of time, something on the order of an hour or two. So it is actually a functional range. The target for us is typically 28.5 degrees. The reasons for that are mostly for synchronicity in development from one lab to another, and it just happens to be pretty widespread in terms of its use. You can obviously raise them at higher and lower temperatures, and that includes embryos and adult fish. pH, power of hydrogen, the tolerance is pretty wide. I would actually say that these fish can probably handle something even lower than 6, and I know that they can handle slightly above 9.5. I've seen them at 10. Makes me pretty nervous, but they can tolerate it. You just don't want to do it for a long time. And again, reversing these changes somewhat gradually is the goal if an accident happens. The details about pH are probably fairly elementary to most people that are doing any water quality work and any aquaculture work with fish, but they will fluctuate in these research systems based on nitrification and respiration. Remember, respiration is producing CO2, and when it dissolves in the water, you've got carbonic acid. Typically in zebrafish systems, we only dose with something like sodium bicarbonate or a buffer. So our only real control in most of these systems is to bring pH up. Very rarely are people using acids to bring pH down. Water hardness comes in two varieties. Again, a huge range of tolerance here. The target is above 100 ppm. It's very, very difficult to do. Typically, it means that we have to have some sort of a reactor to dissolve something like crushed coral, which is available in sand form and in large particle form as well. General hardness is one of the measurements that we use. It's really common to use these strip tests to measure water chemistry, and I think most of them are fantastic, and they work quickly and pretty consistently. Alkalinity is the other measure of hardness, also known as KH, or carbonate hardness. And specifically with respect to general hardness, the effect that you need to be thinking about metabolically is that in a situation of decreased general hardness, the fish are at a challenge to keep the ions basically in their body because the water is trying to steal it from them. So when you increase that general hardness, it decreases the stress of the fish for osmoregularity. It also decreases the toxicity of dissolved metals like copper and zinc. And those are pretty important because those metals are actually fairly common in municipal water supplies. And depending on the type of research system that you have, there may be components of your pump and valves and pressure transmitters and things like this that contain some of these metals. And of course, copper can be pretty toxic to fish. So anything we can do to minimize the toxicity of metals that may exist in these systems is a good thing. Soft water, low in ions, is kind of repeating myself, but it's difficult for these fish to maintain that homeostasis through osmoregulation in soft water conditions. So lastly, with respect to general hardness, the higher hardness levels can actually increase the facilitating of that osmoregulation, and not only oocyte production, but also bone formation and maintenance. Carbonate hardness, this is one where we are often adding to the carbonate hardness in our systems by dosing for pH, because we're using sodium bicarbonate and some of the other buffers that are found in, for example, synthetic sea salts like Instant Ocean that people commonly use. It's also good to keep that alkalinity high as well, for the very same reason as general hardness, for the toxicity of things like copper and zinc and even aluminum. Salinity and conductivity. The salinity tolerance is really massive. 2 ppt, I think, is a really conservative tolerance level. I've seen these fish totally swimming and happy in 4 parts per thousand. That's a pretty big increase from 2 parts per thousand. And in fact, it's really common for people to use in the fish trade and in fish health to use salt and salinity to help deal with illness or pathogens. If the fish can tolerate a rapid increase to a higher salt level, a lot of the pathogens that they can be afflicted with, and that includes parasites, don't tolerate it. Conductivity tolerance. Conductivity and salinity are essentially directly related. Look at the target that we have here, 3 to 1200 microsiemens. I can tell you that, for example, in our nursery here at WashU, we run that system at 2000 microsiemens all the time, and it's not uncommon to see it jump up to close to 3000, for example, when we start flow on a lot of tanks that have previously been static and been sitting with rotifers in them. once that water gets flushed into the system, it has an impact on the whole system. The ability to modify salinity and conductivity are done typically hand in hand, and that's also through dosing with salt. And my preference here is to use a blend of two things, and one is a food grade salt, just 99.99% pure sodium chloride, and we're using a little bit of instant ocean as well, mostly because of the buffering capacity in it. It should be pointed out that instant ocean has absolutely zero actual seawater in it. It's all lab made from lab quality ingredients. Some of them are technical grade and some of them are food grade, and some of them may even be pharmaceutical grade, but these folks are not going out and evaporating sea salt and selling you what's left. The sodium ions are necessary for these fish. So we definitely don't want to keep them at too low of a salt concentration. They'll be working very hard to try and get it from the salt or even from their food. The processes of that regulatory function have a high metabolic cost to the fish. It usually comes in the form of respiration, and it will also come in the form of causing them to either eat a lot more or a lot less, depending on which end of the spectrum the problem's at. DO, and I want to make sure that we all notice that this is totally different from total dissolved gas pressure or total gas pressure or total dissolved gas, TDG, TDGP, TGP. These are all terms for the same thing. In the case of dissolved oxygen, we would like to keep that at 80% or greater saturation. At this temperature, it's pretty hard to get 100% saturation for very long. Cold water holds oxygen better. Warm water has a much more difficult time holding on to it. We can do some additional aeration with these systems, but typically if the water is flowing in a research zebrafish system, you have enough oxygen. But you can use things like Venturi gas injectors that are just simply injecting breathing air, room air into it. You have to be very, very careful when you do this sort of thing, and these monitors for total gas pressure are becoming really ubiquitous in zebrafish systems. Typically this is perpetuated by the horror stories of gas bubble disease. Hyperoxia is the technical term for this. It can be used in the right hands to manage really high density aquaculture situations, but that's not really what we're doing in these labs, so we really want to try and stay away from it. So a quick review on water quality of those culture condition guidelines. This isn't the tolerances, but these are the ranges that the majority of people are maintaining these at. Temperature of 18 to 24, sorry, that's 18 to 28 degrees Celsius, my mistake. Alkalinity, if you can keep it on the high end of this range, you'll be doing great, and the same goes for hardness. 80 is pretty typical around here, and I'm still running some crushed coral. It's still very difficult to keep it. I love seeing it around 100, but that typically happens in our nursery where we've got higher conductivity to begin with. pH of 6 to 8. I'm pretty happy about 7.4, 7.5. It seems to be a pretty good number in terms of stability with our systems. Salinity, I prefer to look at that in terms of conductivity. We run our adult systems at 850 microsiemens, which is pretty close to the middle of the road for this range. Ammonia, Unionized, you want to keep it really, really low. Please be aware this is different from total ammonia nitrogen. The percentage of unionized ammonia in your total ammonia nitrogen will vary specifically in relation to pH. Nitrite, I prefer to see it 0 as well, but less than 1 milligram per liter, 1 ppm. Nitrate, it's nice to keep it less than 50, but you're going to see swings in that value based on the time of day that you do your water quality testing. And if you do your water quality testing for some of these parameters within 30 minutes of feeding, they're not going to be the same as they are 30 minutes before feeding. Chlorine, you want to have absolutely none of it in your system. DO, again, 80% or better. And CO2, if you measure it, less than 5 milligrams per liter. Just a review on that total gas pressure and gas bubble disease or hyperoxia. When the sum total pressure of all of the gases in that water exceeds the atmospheric pressure, you start to have this supersaturation. And the effect is well documented. If you know people in this field, you probably have heard a story or may know someone who has had this problem. And the realities of it are that it happens very quickly. You've got very little time, 10 minutes or less typically, to correct the situation. Typically that means shutting down the water until you can figure out where your problem is. If you have a second pump to switch over to, that's usually a very good way to get started to see if you can get the pressure back down. Here are some examples. A number of these slides are courtesy of Jason Cockington in Australia. He's in Queensland, and he shared with me a number of these slides. Some of our colleagues have sent these slides around to help us see, what this looks like. You can actually see in the fins, in the dorsal fin of this fish that's closest, the bubbles in the fin. These fish are doing their very, very best to get rid of that excess gas, and if they can't do it pretty quickly, they'll perish pretty quick. So our next topic is nutrition. This one's a pretty hot topic these days with zebrafish, and I'm going to cover a number of items here, and we'll probably do full circle on nutrition a couple of times. First in this section, and then again when we get into some specifics about larval culture and breeding. So the nutrient requirements for proteins and amino acids, specifically these are required to provide these indispensable amino acids and the non-indispensable ones and nitrogen. These are typically found in our foods, and the demand for these varies not only with species but even with life stages, and that is definitely true for zebrafish. The total requirement really is the minimum protein that's needed to satisfy the demand. And as I mentioned just before this, it does change with life stages. We typically start these fish with much, much higher protein when they're young and start to reduce it with some of the adult diets. The diets with the excess proteins will increase ammonia production. That's a result of the metabolism of the fish. You'll also see this manifest as sort of a foam. I've had people sort of almost panic because they see a foam within 10 or 15 minutes of heavy feeding, and it almost looks like soap in the water. This is one of the reasons that protein fractionators or foam fractionators are used in aquaculture. And if you feed to excess or have a big facility that a lot of food goes into all at the same time, you may see this in your sumps and in the tanks and in other areas. And although maybe just a few years ago, if I had been asked, I would have said that protein skimmers were really not needed in these particular systems. I certainly changed my mind about that over the last couple of years as I've seen higher quality diets and higher protein diets become available, and we've started using them, and we do see the protein. The diets that we're using for zebrafish have a 29 to 50, 51% crude protein content, and it seems to support the optimal growth for other cyprinids, things like fathead minnows and golden shiners. And these are fish species where a lot of nutritional work has been done, and it appears to sort of overlap or mesh with what we see in terms of performance from zebrafish. Lipids, fats, these are an important source of energy. The essential and non-essential fatty acids, the polyunsaturated fatty acids, these are things that we're starting now to get a very decent handle really on what works best with zebrafish. Although I have to say that not nearly enough work has been done to date, published work has been done to really say what the ideals are for the various life stages of zebrafish. The zebrafish do possess that enzymatic machinery to elongate some of the PUFAs into the HUFAs, the highly unsaturated fatty acids. But if they can be provided in the diet, then that reduces the metabolic cost to the fish to get this particular lipid. EPA and DHA and arachidonic acid, these are all things that we're finding as supplements or additives in a lot of the foods that are being used with zebrafish today. One of these aspects of fish nutrition that's sort of peculiar is that in zebrafish, they display this typical warm water pattern where we have a higher N6 to N3 ratio, and most commercially diets that are available really are formulated in exactly the opposite way. And it really seems to be sort of driven by the economy of aquaculture in general. There are not a lot of warm water fish that end up on dinner plates. So as a result, we don't have a lot of these commercially available bulk manufactured diets that are really good for this particular ratio, a higher N6 to N3. The specifics for zebrafish, again, are unknown. I can be a broken record and say that for virtually every slide in this nutrition section. Carbohydrates, there is no dietary requirement for carbohydrates in fish. It is an important source of energy. It's used for binding feeds. It's an important filler in feed manufacturing. It's much less expensive than some of the other binders like fish meal. And so it is commonly used. The ability for zebrafish to digest these simple and complex carbohydrates is not well understood. Because these fish are essentially omnivorous, they do ingest, digest, and incorporate aspects of phytoplankton. We have to imagine that they have some ability to assimilate nutritionally some of the carbohydrates, but the degree to which they can really do this is not well understood. And from my perspective, I would say that they get it much more efficiently if it's already gut loaded into an organism that is adapted to eating it, like some of these invertebrates. So Robinson et al. Concluded that zebrafish can display good growth rates at inclusion rates of up to 25%. And really, we don't need any more than 5%. And excess levels may actually decrease growth and reproduction. And furthermore, when you're increasing the amount of carbohydrates in these diets, you're decreasing the amount of something else. So remember, it's better to get some of these fish meals and some of these other proteins and ingredients into the fish food. Vitamins. We know that some of these are essential. In what amounts, we don't really know all that much. We do know that A, D, E, and K, C, thiamine, folate, a number of these are essential for fish. They do have to be provided in the diet. There is some indication that some of their gut microbial gut contents may be able to manufacture some of these for them. The live feeds are very often rich in these vitamins, and that requirement can be satisfied by giving them some of these live feeds that are common in zebrafish. Again, the specifics for zebrafish are completely unknown. Vitamin C, ascorbic acid, A and E, they've all been shown to be important for long-term production of quality gametes and growth and reproduction in fish. However, just because it's in the diet that you're feeding your fish doesn't mean that they're getting it. We'll cover a little bit of that in a moment, but vitamin C and some of these other vitamins are a little bit delicate, and they require that you handle them properly. Mineral requirements. These are inorganic elements that are required by the fish in trace amounts. They're important for bone formation, osmoregulation, nervous system function, etc. They can be obtained through the diet, but they can also be obtained through the external environment or their water, essentially across absorption through their gills, or even through the ingestion of the water that's in that is their environment. And this actually goes back to water quality, where we're using the correct buffers, and we may be dissolving something like crushed coral to provide some of these minerals. These live feeds also often contain these, either in their shell or in their gut contents. The dietary requirement will depend on your water chemistry. So when we go look back to that water chemistry slide, those water chemistry slides, keeping those hardness values up will reduce the amount that you need to provide in the feed. So feed types that are available for fish: live feeds and formulated feeds, really just two types. The most common live feeds fed to zebrafish are Artemia, rotifers, and ciliates like Paramecium. The formulated feeds come in actually a handful of varieties: pellets and a mash or crumble. The mash or crumble, I should say, probably often starts out as a pellet, and then it's broken and sieved to a variety of sizes and then packaged as such. The flakes are typically a solution that is spray dried and then scraped. We've probably all seen something like Tetramin flake that's at your local pet store. You give to your goldfish. It's great for your goldfish. It's not great for aquaculture, where performance of your fish in terms of gamete production and growth is important. The larval diets come in some of these forms as well. Some of them are also available in a liquid form. So specifically talking about some of the advantages and disadvantages of live feeds. The advantages are probably outweigh the disadvantages. The amenability to mass culture, and what I mean by that is that you can relatively easily culture a number of live organisms in the lab in buckets or cones or cylinders that are made specifically for this purpose, inductor cones, vessels, etc. And they have great nutritional profiles often on their own. They also have the ability to gut load which is really one of the most important parts for some of these smaller foods and first feeding items like rotifers. They're highly digestible. They're attractive because they have not only a motion that attracts fish, what we often call the live prey feeding response, but they undoubtedly have a smell as well that's an attractant. Some of the disadvantages is that they can be variable in their nutritional profile. This is often a result of the way in which that they are handled or harvested, or even just simply the way that they're cultured. Labor intensive, and I have a question mark here because I think that most people have this notion that they are labor intensive before they really get into it, before they really get used to doing it and get good at it. I would counter by saying that with respect to rotifers, that it is much less labor intensive for me to culture, harvest, and use rotifers than it is certainly than it is for Artemia, and we're not even culturing Artemia, we're just simply hatching them. So labor intensive, I think, is up for debate, and it really depends on your expertise and your experience. They can be a source of pathogens. There's absolutely no doubt about it. That's very much true with respect to Artemia. These are wild harvested, wild caught organisms. And if you really look through a microscope, even at the dry cyst in your Artemia cans, you'll find feathers and a number of things that happen to be very similar in size to the Artemia cyst, and therefore they're not filtered out, and so it requires additional work. That aspect definitely makes Artemia more labor intensive, and I'm specifically referring to bleach decapsulation. This is a picture of a first instar Artemia nauplii. If you don't know what they look like, you need to pull some of them out of your culture tank before you feed them and get familiar with what they look like and their body plan. These are an aquatic crustacean, and they are relatively easy to culture. They're definitely easy to hatch. They have a good nutritional profile in general, as long as you don't let them go too far. Bioencapsulation when they're used properly, and what I mean by that is that at the stage that you see this image, these organisms don't have a mouth and they don't have a complete gut tract, so if you start dumping Selco or something in there to enrich them, you would be just as well advised to dump it down the drain, because these fish, or these Artemia nauplii, are incapable of incorporating it into their tissues. In order to do that, you have to raise them well beyond this stage. And one of the major advantages to Artemia nauplii disappears when you do that. They become bigger and they're not readily available to your smallest fish. Paramecium, still pretty commonly used. They're a freshwater ciliate. They have a limited nutritional value. They are fairly easy to culture. I will tell you they're quite stinky, and getting culture containers of paramecium up to the densities that you can very easily do with rotifers is very challenging. They are good for a first feeding item by comparison to lots of other things, particularly prepared diets, because they move and they presumably also possess an odor and so on. But I will show you a couple of videos that illustrate how they differ from some of the other live organisms. The third live feed type, rotifers, these are a small aquatic invertebrate, plankton. This is zooplankton. They exist both in salt and fresh water. They have limited nutritional value on their own. However, they are still superior to paramecium in that respect. The real point to think about here is that these organisms will readily incorporate any number of algae, etc., that you want to feed them. People have used yeast and rice bran and a number of things to maintain these cultures. And one of the great things about that is that you can have a great stable culture on a rather inexpensive diet, and then when you do your harvest to feed out to your fish, your larval fish in particular, you can follow an enrichment protocol and essentially gut load these guys with some stuff that's really fantastic for your larval zebrafish. And one of the things that I really like about them is that they are relatively easy to culture in mass quantities. We regularly grow these rotifers here at WashU between 750 and 1,000 per milliliter. The strain that we're using right now is an S-type, and they're only about 35 microns, so they're nice and small, and the larval fish just go bananas over them. I should also say the adult fish do too, but we're really, really happy with the results that we get using a rotifer. This next slide is a video clip of the rotifer, and what I hope to illustrate here is sort of this lumbering movement that rotifers exhibit. That they can't raise at all, and they've actually called them very often, they have very often called them homozygous lethal. But the reality is that the homozygous lethal label that they get branded with may actually just simply be a result of the fact that the fish can't get to the food that's being offered to them. And we've watched these fish, some really sickly fish with terrible edema and other problems, phenotypes that are a product of their genotype. We've watched them eat in a petri dish without really even moving, and the rotifers basically bump into them and they eat them. And this is not something that happens with, certainly not with prepared diets, and I've never seen it happen with paramecium. I'm going to show you a video clip in just a moment of paramecium, and their movement is fast and it's often in a straight line. It's very difficult for the fish to catch them, comparatively speaking. I'm going to answer a question that's come to me real quickly. Environmental enrichment, does it make a difference? The fact that you are providing, in a sense, environmental enrichment to the fish by giving them a live prey item to chase and eat is undoubtedly making an impact on the fish. Qualifying and quantifying the effect of that enrichment has not been done to my knowledge. I would love to see it done. We know that a number of scientists have used things like rotifers to elicit neurological responses in 2 and 3 and 4 day old larval fish. And this is now starting to become well documented, the effects of that movement of a prey item across the visual field of the fish. We know that they physically will move their eyeball to follow the organism, and it elicits a pattern of firing in the neurons of that zebrafish brain. So to directly answer the question about environmental enrichment, if indeed this is in reference to live feeds, I think it does make a difference, and you're absolutely right, it's not well covered in the literature. Let me knock out a couple questions here. Any experience with breeding Medaka? No. I don't have any personal experience breeding Medaka. And do you use the same parameters? My gut feeling is that they're probably not very different in terms of the water quality parameters that are used, but those water quality parameters are available through some literature search as well. All right, I'm going to advance here. So on the notion of live feeds, there are still a couple of dry foods that are available that were live feeds, things like bloodworms, chronomid larvae, tubifex worms. There are a number of them out there that people use, and some of them to great success. But you should be cautious about things like tubifex worms and bloodworms. They really should be avoided. They transmit nematodes and other parasites. Tubifex worms are actually a host of a severe neurological pathogen in salmonids, and it's just not an area that's probably worth getting into if you don't have to. They're great enrichment, I think, for the home aquaria. They're great in the pet trade, et cetera, but it's not one of the things that I would personally recommend for a number of reasons in the setting of laboratory aquaculture raising zebrafish. To talk about some of these formulated diets, so the advantages and disadvantages, the disadvantages are largely related to the choice of food and that you use the formulated diet, and how it's stored is extremely important, and how it's delivered is also very, very important. So the advantages include the fact that many of them, and I want to be specific here, many of the high quality aquaculture formulated feeds, things that are designed to impart success to fish farmers whose livelihoods, mortgages, et cetera, rely on the standard metric of feed conversion ratio. These are actually designed to replace live diets. I would not extend that quality to something like Tetram and Flake. They are cheaper and easier to use than live diets in virtually every case. They're easy to quantify, meaning how much of a nutritional, any nutritional parameters going into the fish, and how much food you're putting into the system. You can deliver a known amount with those specific nutrients. They have a higher dry weight than live diets. In fact, sometimes it's exponential. Disadvantages come from things like complete replacement of nutritional requirements are difficult to achieve if you don't really know what those requirements are. Water stability varies not only from feed to feed, but particularly with the type of formulated feed. And their attractiveness and palatability varies. You may have seen fish gobble up a pellet of food and then spit it right back out and do it over and over and over and over and over again. That to me is not a palatable diet. The best of these formulated feed types really is going to be a pellet, and the narrow size distribution is a huge advantage. They have decent to good water quality stability. Some of them can still look like they just went in the water 20, 30, 40 minutes later. They have a predictable nutritional profile. One of the best aspects, physical aspects of these pellet diets is that they're free-flowing, they don't clump, they don't compact. Certain types can be used exclusively in zebrafish. But it's important to know about the food that you're buying because every feed is different. These processed feed types that are a mash or a crumble, I mentioned before, they start out as a big pellet. They crush them. They have a much wider size distribution. The stability of the water quality is decent compared to something like a flake, but you'll often see them degrade rather quickly. It is somewhat free-flowing, but it does have a tendency to clump. And this is largely due to those irregular shapes that sort of mesh and bind with one another and form a bigger piece. There are a lot of them commercially available, and some even claim to be complete for zebrafish. Flake type food, huge size distribution. They are really unstable. 30 seconds into getting them in the water, they're falling apart, and the nutritional content is getting leached into the water, and it's gone. These larval feeds are usually micro pellets or a narrow range of the crush or crumble. There's lots of them available that are used for zebrafish. The micro-encapsulated ones are really very good because they're very stable in the water. The performance of zebrafish larvae can be pretty good if you know what you're doing, but it's very labor intensive and it's very easy to make a mistake and overfeed a tank. Lower growth rates and typically lower survival rates compared to live foods. The handling and storage of live feeds is important as it is with those dry feeds. They need to be harvested and fed out as close to that hatching period as possible, in particular with Artemia, unless you're going to enrich it. And you're talking about waiting at least another 6 to 8 hours. So from a labor perspective and from a planning perspective in a zebrafish facility, this is not done very often, and it's maybe not all that great of an idea in most cases when these other alternatives are available. The nauplii will suffocate and die unless they're really heavily aerated. So when you collect your Artemia, you need to feed them out immediately and keep them aerated for as long as possible. They can be collected in fish water and kept at 4 degrees for several hours before feeding, and they sort of slow everything down, and most of them will stay alive. But you need to be looking at them under the microscope to make sure that what your practices are really providing what you expect. The dry cysts can be stored for years, and in fact 2 to 3 years is probably a really conservative estimate. The decapsulated cysts can be stored in a hypersaline solution for several weeks. We typically decapsulate something on the order of 3 weeks to a month of Artemia at a time. These processed feeds, doesn't matter if it's a flake or a pellet or a crumble or a powder, the nutrients can leach out rapidly when they're hydrated. So they need to be fed dry, meaning not putting them in a bottle, filling it up with water and squirting that into the tank. That's just not a good practice, and it's actually pretty well understood why. I'm actually going to show you a couple of graphics here as well. Storage, heat, moisture, and light are important factors. These are perishable foods. Keep them cold, keep them in the dark. Freezing is maybe not a great idea unless it's particularly directed by the manufacturer, because when you pull these things out of the freezer, condensation forms on them, and if you put them right back in the freezer after you get what you want, you're going to end up with a pretty degraded product. So speaking specifically about leaching of water-soluble vitamins, when you put some of these diets, particularly the ones that are not microencapsulated into the water, within 30 seconds, you experience a tremendous amount of loss of a number of important water-soluble vitamins, particularly vitamin C. I mean, it's just almost gone. This is water-soluble protein leaching when you hydrate some of these diets, and you've only got about a minute, really, is the take-home message here, to get all that food into the fish. And when we think about how we're asked to feed to satiation in 5 to 10 minutes, you can see that within 5 minutes, they're gone. This is a video that was shared with me by Chris Lawrence. Thanks, Chris, if you or any of your colleagues are out there. And this video shows a good way of delivering some of the dry feeds. This is video for slide 38.
To feed tanks pellet with this new dispenser, simply depress the plunger all the way, allowing the feed to flow through the tube and into the tank. Ensure that all the food from each plunge flows into the tank before moving on to the next one.
Spreads out when it hits the water. I'm a big fan of these videos for training purposes, and in fact, that's what that video was for, was training purpose, to show someone how to do it properly. But it was really nice to see, and I remember being pretty excited the first time I saw that, particularly when you were able to see how the food distributed itself across the water. So the generalities, the specific nutrient requirements are unknown. You can feed them just about anything and still get results. And I know people that have fed them single-cell organisms, bacteria, yeast, etc., and they can still get results. The right diet does make a difference when it comes to spawning success and survival and growth, and even gamete quality and immune function, and a huge variety of aspects of fish culture. Suboptimal diets will give you suboptimal output in all of those areas, and along with water chemistry, poor nutrition is the most important cause of problems in zebrafish facilities. That's particularly the case for reproduction. Feeding approaches for these fish need to change. Not only the quality and the nutrient profile, but the quantity and the frequency of feeding. The feeding regime and diet really needs to be adjusted according to life stage. I'm going to go back to that in the next couple of slides here. The things that tend to increase with the age of the fish are flow rates, because you need more water exchange and the fish are better able to handle it. The amount of feed tends to increase at a given feeding, as does the particle size and the lipid content. Conversely, the feed frequency tends to decrease as the fish age. The daily feed input becomes more relevant to the percent of the body weight of the fish, and the protein content tends to decrease as well as they get older. So this notion of larval stage feeding for the 5 to 30 days, when you really start to optimize some of these feeding techniques, the range here probably becomes more like 5 to 20 days or 5 to 15 days. We want high nutrient, high protein content in these really young fish, 40 to 60%, lots of fat, 6 to 15%. These need to be stable in the water column. Live feeds really can be the best for this initial first feeding. It's great to have these feeds that are in suspension rather than negatively buoyant or positively buoyant, because this is where the fish tend to spend most of their time. On these first feeders, there's really no way to get something into their mouth and down their throat if it's bigger than a couple hundred microns. But as soon as they grow, you can start to increase the size of the food. These are pretty simple agastric fish, and these feeds need to be highly digestible, specifically with respect to those fats and proteins. Hydrolyzed proteins seem to be on the rise in these diets that are available, and they really seem to work very well. Acceptability, this is probably also palatability. These larvae need something moving to really be efficient feeders, something that moves and has a smell to stimulate them to feed. Again, live feeds are the best. The densities of food, what we aim for here is to have a really high encounter rate, meaning that there's a ton of rotifers in the tank so that these fish are essentially bumping into food all the time. That's almost impossible to do with prepared diets. They essentially need to be fed constantly, which is why we like to essentially perform a co-culture where we have fish and rotifers in the same tank, up until the point where they can eat bigger items. The juvenile stage, 30 to potentially 90 days. These numbers are coming from ZFIN and from a lot of the common literature, but we're going to review them again in the next section, where I'm going to challenge the notion of some of these time ranges being linked to a life stage of the fish. As they get older, again, the protein is still pretty high, and so is the lipids, but they can start to come down, they can start to increase in the food size. These fish don't necessarily need just suspended feeds. At that time, they can feed in the top to the bottom of the water quality, or of the water column. They still need to be highly digestible because the fish are still agastric minnows throughout their whole life. Really the same palatability and acceptability is true for juveniles as it is for larval fish. Same is true for density and frequency. The adult stage, here's that ubiquitous number of 90 days, which I'll definitely be challenging and asking you to think about and challenge in the future. We drop the protein when they get to this age. We drop the amount of fat that's really needed, but we do want to talk more about having the PUFA and HUFA content in these feeds, particularly for gamete production. They still need to be highly stable diets. They can feed anywhere in the water column. Anything greater than about 750 or 800 microns is just too big for adult zebrafish. It's really not necessary. Still needs to be digestible. The density of food, or the amount of food that you're giving their fish, this is where we start to look at aquaculture standards, where 1 to 5% of the body weight daily is what needs to be given to these fish, depending on your application. This number can increase if you have like routine breeding fish, but you still need to keep an eye on it to maintain healthy fish and not obese fish or egg-bound fish. Feeding these fish 1 to a few times a day, depending on what they're being used for. Here's a couple of videos for slide number 45. You can use behavioral cues of these fish to indicate how much food is enough. There's a video that's going to pop up here on the left, and we're going to compare that to the video that we see on the right. So that video was our left-hand video, and really the thing that is important to notice is those fish were all over the water column, and they were traversing the water column up and down and right and left. The attitude that they had in the water was often moving and almost a searching sort of behavior. The second video for slide 45 will show some different behaviors. So you can see these nice sort of distended bellies, and these fish are just sort of horizontal in the water column, and they're just swimming and moving. They're not exhibiting these behaviors that are sort of searching. I'm going to answer a couple of couple of questions real quick. What's the ideal target density for zebrafish in a research system? Unfortunately, I don't think there is an ideal target density. I think a lot of it has to do with what your goals are and what your system can handle in terms of its biological filtration and the amount of oxygen that's in these systems. I'm only about halfway through the presentation and I'm already essentially at the end of my allotted time, but I'm going to keep running on until they get the hook out on me. The ideal target density, I mean, I think that one goal should be to make sure that if water stops flowing, that your fish don't all die within, you know, a couple of hours. And test it. See how they behave when you shut your water off and in a tank that's been fed within a couple of hours, and take a look. And if you see them really, really stressing, your density may be too high and your water quality may not be adequate to support that density. We maintain fish at no more than 10 fish a liter unless there's a really good reason for it here, like we want to skew sex ratio or we want to runt them for some scientifically valid purpose. I would say it's most common in zebrafish facilities that I've spoken with people around the world to keep them at anywhere from 2 to 5, and it's probably still very common 5 to 10. I hear the number 8 tossed around a lot, but 8's kind of middle of the road for 5 to 10. One more question real quick before I go any further. With respect to IACUC requirements, at what stage do you consider embryo/larvae as vertebrates and thus report them in animal protocols? So your IACUC or your governing body for your institution is free to make up their mind about this. I believe OLAW calls this 3 days now, and we call them 5 days. But when the protocols are written, they're very often defined about how many of which life stage will be needed in a given research year. So an embryo really is an embryo until it can hatch on its own. And they're a larval fish until they complete metamorphosis, which is typically around 14 days. And then they're no longer a larvae, they're a fish. So some of this is semantics and some of it is policy, and it's going to depend on your institution and the country that you're in. So a quick review about feeding and what you can feed and how often. When they're young, when they're really young, continuous. Here's that 14-day mark where we say 3 to 5 times daily. It's almost continuous if we can do it too. And then as they get older, 1 to 3, maybe 5 times a day, depending on how much food you give them at a given feeding. So a quick evaluation of some live feeds. Here's some performance data on the left, the average size at day 12. The blue line is rotifer fed fish. This comes from Chris Lawrence too. Thanks again, Chris. I have data that essentially mirrors what Chris has here, and I think almost anyone who's done this work sees the same thing. There's a prodigious amount of growth when you compare this to Artemia fed fish. And the Paramecia fed fish are right in the middle. This is probably mostly due to the size of the organism, the ability of these fish to catch them and eat them. Sorry, let's skip that guy. I often get the question in emails, etc., about what we're feeding here. This is the diet that we're feeding as a prepared diet from beginning to end, alpha to omega, A to Z. We're real happy with it. The stuff has the proper ratio. It flows really well. It has a 2.5-year shelf life. There are a number of good reasons to use this food, not the least of which is that it's definable in terms of its content. We have batch number information, and overall we're very, very happy with the performance of this food. And really the take-home message is the processed diet of any kind helps to standardize the feeding because it's easy to quantify. So how all of the things that we've talked about so far, one of the things that they lead up to is the breeding of these fish. So we'll switch gears here for just about 4 slides. They're crepuscular spawners. That means that they'll spawn in the morning and in the evening, but we typically and traditionally in these facilities breed them in the morning. We say when the sun comes up, they like to breed, and that's pretty much true, but they like to do that when the sun goes down as well. And you'll find that to be true if you leave unsex-segregated fish in a breeding tank overnight, and you look at the embryos. It's very common to find some that were born basically when the light went off. Spawning tank conditions are important. Low volumes of water require tank exchange or water exchange. Typically this comes in the form of flow, but I also know people who will lift up an insert and put it into a container of fresh water in the morning. The accumulation of those metabolites overnight can negatively impact breeding success. Enrichment helps. There's no question about this. What I mean is artificial plants. And imparting a gradient on the substrate or the false bottom of the tank provides the fish with that preferred spawning environment. There is a video here for this one, and this is an external spawning tank with no gradient. And I just want you to observe the interactions, the interaction behaviors between these fish in this tank.
On radio.
Let's advance to the next slide. This is some shallow water behaving, spawning behavior. This is analogous to putting one of those breeder tanks on an angle or a bias, imparting it in some way, give them this ability to find shallow water because that's where the females like to and prefer to lay their eggs. There is a video for this one. This is slide 52. I mean, I observe this day to day in the facility, and the females will quite literally get themselves out of the water and prefer to spawn there. If you want to maximize your spawning success, a couple of tips that I would give you are keep the males and females separate overnight. It reduces the stress because the interactions between these fish in that setting can be pretty aggressive. Use artificial plants to provide cover. Fish love cover, period. This reduces stress. Low volume water flow, if it's available, helps to keep the water fresh, which also reduces stress. There's a theme here. And the data that you see here below is actually some an experiment we did here a number of years ago using plants to identify whether or not it was really worth our time and if it was really effective. And in the blue box, we basically say on the top number where we have a success rate of 61% is the male has the plant. These fish are separated, but the male has the plant. On the other one, 63%, the female has the plant. So statistically, we're not talking about a big difference between the two. But in the red box, if there are no plants present, we drop down to less than 46% success rate. With an N value of 72, this is statistically significant. And if you put a plant on both sides of the divider, a 75% increase. That's statistically an increase from choosing one side or the other. And that was 88 trials. Larviculture, I'm going to breeze through a couple of these slides because we've already covered them in a sense in previous sections of nutrition, but this is one of the things that is one of the sort of early humps and difficulties a lot of people have. These are a couple pictures of larval zebrafish. They love to occupy different areas in the water column, and you can see this sort of slanted approach by the middle fish on the left. These fish are hunting in a tank with rotifers. Most important part of larviculture is good embryo care. If you can't get the polyps and the fungi and the results of hypoxia out of the equation, you're not going to have good success. The old adage of garbage in, garbage out is very, very true. There's a video here on the right. These are collops. People call them twirlies and a number of things. They're just an absolute scourge in a petri dish of zebrafish embryos or even larvae that haven't been able to get moving yet. Roz, can you play the video for slide 57? And I may have actually, my apologies, I sent the wrong column video, but that's a pretty good characterization of what they look like. That one's been false colored, but they just decimate a dish. And in fact, this is what your dishes will often look like. You have these sort of remains that are almost just, they're just a smudge on the bottom of the dish. If you see this, this is the result of a polyp infestation in a dish. The best practice is to move your embryos when you do your cleanups to a new dish with new embryo media, thereby trying to wash out any contaminants, including polyps. If you use pipettes, glass pipettes, fire polishing is a really smart thing to do. You can fire polish a handful of pipettes pretty quickly and keep them around for a really long time. I know that if I were being handled by a glass transfer pipette, I would much prefer the one on the right with a nice smooth edge than the one on the left, which is right out of the box. You got to do lots of cleanups of your embryos, especially if you keep them at high density. If you don't get these dead ones out and all the other junk and detritus out of these dishes, or get the embryos moved to new clean dishes, it will kill off the rest of them. It can also cause hypoxia of the ones that do survive. You'll find more than 10,000 hits on Google Scholar for zebrafish hypoxia. The effects are wide-ranging from developmental retardation to all sorts of abnormalities. You just want to avoid it. So in terms of larviculture, meaning growing these fish from embryo all the way through the larval stage and into their adulthood, ZFIN says these are the time frames, that an adult is 90 days. They actually say a breeding adult. That's just not necessarily the case. I don't believe that these things are as temporal, fixed temporal variables as we see in this chart. So here's two clear definitions in my view. On the left you see embryo still in the chorion, and on the right you have larvae. These fish are ready to eat. They consume most of their yolk. They've got a mouth. They've got a swim bladder. So the question becomes, when do you start feeding? This was a quick trial where we started some at 4, 5, and 6 days. Even at 4 days, these fish were growing. 5 days is our standard here. If you wait until 6 days, they can still catch up. But if you wait any longer, they won't, and I'll show you some information on that in just a moment. A lot of people say, but they're 5 days old or they're 6 days old. Well, temperature impacts their development. If they're 5 days at 28.5 degrees, then you'll see good response. If they're 5 days at 26 degrees, you won't. And this is an example of too early and too much water actually in the tank as well. It's too early, and you can tell because they're still using their hatching gland to try and get near the surface of the water. They do not have a swim bladder, and therefore are really not good at eating. They can't really chase anything and eat anyway. So time isn't the best or the absolute answer. Here is that same chart run out to about 10.5 days, and the 5-day fish really began to outperform everybody. If you wait until 7 days, and I think there are a lot of people out there that do wait until about 7 days, these fish have a very hard time catching up, and that extends for the rest of their life. In fact, here we have an example of those 10-day fish. These are the same clutch of fish. The ones on the left were offered food at 4 days, and the ones on the right offered food at 7 days. And I think the results really speak for themselves. Here's that chart run all the way out to 43, actually, well, past 43, but the arrows run to 43 days post-fertilization. So those fish that we waited until 7 days were only 17 millimeters in length, and that's snout to vent length, or sorry, snout to caudal peduncle length at 43 days, compared to 22.5 millimeters on average for those that were fed starting on day 5. So first feeding methods and options. I've got 2 videos on this one. They're small, but they illustrate the swimming behavior of paramecia, and they're the only videos I have been able to find, and I want you to see them because I want you to notice and compare it to the rotifer video where you saw that lumbering slow movement. This is slide 70, and there are 2 videos, top left and bottom left, to compare. What is the pause button? So one thing to think about is that some of these algae that are available commercially are potentially useful as green water feeding techniques, and there are other plankton that are used in fish culture, and there's no doubt we'll see more of those in zebrafish in the future. Green water technique, if you use it, make it really, really dark, but provide your fish some water exchange if possible. Oops. I've got a quick video here of larval fish feeding on rotifers. It's very difficult to see them, so I stuck a camera in a tank. This is video for slide 72. And I promise we're near the end for the 60 of you that have stuck around. I appreciate it. So let me show you a couple of photographs of what we have in the fish facility here all the time, because I think it's pretty enlightening to see exactly what these tanks look like with fish and rotifers in them. So rotifers exhibit phototaxis like lots of plankton do, and so they like to accumulate in the places where the light is essentially focused by the shapes of the tanks. We've got a couple that are pretty good. So you see this tends to be a little hazier in the front where the light is. And these fish are all throughout the water column. The sort of haziness is actually the cloud of rotifers. There's probably millions of rotifers in these tanks. And initially, right after feeding, they're really quite cloudy, and the fish just go bananas, and they just eat all day long. Now, one thing I do want to point out is that even though there is some detritus and so on in these tanks, you don't want to see it to excess. And it will start to kill your fish. It'll outcompete the rotifers and the fish. So if something like that happens, you do have to do something about it. So one question about rotifers and some of these other foods is how much and how many to feed. And really what I've done here is we sort of did this by the seat of our pants, and then we figured out what we liked and what we were being successful with, and then we started to quantify. And we did that by looking at how many rotifers per milliliter were in our culture, and extrapolating by looking at how much we reduced that harvest to, how concentrated that was, and then how we took that concentrated harvest and fed it out, how many mils. You just have to simply do the math. Your observations will allow you to build something, a chart like this. We're talking about 1,000 rotifers per fish per day. And that just seems to work well for us. Less than that is absolutely fine too. Now, let me go back for just a moment to talk about how much is in these tanks and the possibility of creating a problem in the tank. If it smells bad, or if it looks milky or hazy or cloudy, if there's a scum on the surface or a slick on the surface of the water, use your nose, use your eyes. These are conditions that require an action from you. And you need to think about what actions you have available to you. You need to trust your senses and your intuition. If you wouldn't want to be in there because it's just absolutely foul, the fish are probably not going to do well either. So the best things that you can do are water exchange is the simplest and easiest thing to do. We may turn on the water in one of these tanks and fill it up and let it run until it's nice and clear, and then we'll take it to the sink and pour it out so that we have a reduced water level, so that when we feed it a new batch of rotifers, they still have that nice high encounter rate. You can also use a wide natural bristle paintbrush and run it across the surface to get a scum of water off. The behavior of the fish will indicate some of these conditions, and there's a video here for slide number 80 that shows some of these stressed behaviors of fish that I don't know any other way to say it other than that they look stressed. Easiest thing to do is to turn the water on a drip. Here I've got so this illustrates that scum has no ability to be, cohesive and really form a layer if you've got a rapid drip of water coming into the tank. It breaks the surface tension. Pretty simple. So your observations are the basis for diet changes, meaning how much food and the size of the food. Let them eat the things that they can get in their mouth. I like to empower the staff and the researchers to make decisions and avoid making mistakes by printing a graphic tool like this that allows them to see what food and what type of feeding regime their fish are ready for next. These are printed out on stickers, and these adorn all the fish racks all over the place. They're really handy. So one question I get asked a lot, and there is, I believe, a video for this one. Perhaps not. This is adult fish feeding on rotifers. You can even tell from this still image that these fish are just excited. They know what's coming. They love the smell. They love the taste of it, and they remember it from being very young, and they just go crazy to eat these, 30 to 50 micron organisms, even as adults. Stocking density. Hopefully the person who asked the question about stocking density is still around. Particularly when these fish are really young, stocking density can have a downstream effect. Temperature can too, but stocking density is one that we have a lot more control over typically than temperature. We typically leave our temperature at a set point, and in this case, the take-home message is the more fish in a tank, the more males you're going to have. Not exactly sure all the mechanisms at play there, but that really does seem to be the case. This was some of the raw data, and really, even at low temperature, a high density yielded way more males than females. And there were only 3 out of 206 fish, or 209 fish, that became female in a really high 7 fish per liter. In that case, this was in a different facility, but the take-home message is still the same. This is another chart about feeding about your dosages. These charts are not meant to be instructive for your particular purposes. Don't just take these and run with them. You can take the format that's used and the math that's used and use that, but these numbers may not work well in your situation. But those charts are available for everybody to make good and educated decisions on about how much food needs to be made every day. And while greater than 90 days sexual maturity is really common, using this approach, less than 60 days can be the norm in your facility. Lots of smaller feedings, and avoid the temptation to feed to excess. And by that I mean lots of waste in the tanks. Keep those tanks free of that excessive detritus and waste. It turns them off to eating. So here's a 40-day fish. By ZFIN standards, this is a juvenile fish. This fish went straight from the microscope to a breeding tank and gave me a clutch of 100 eggs or so. So it can be done. That's 28 millimeters snout to caudal peduncle. Other people that measure total length, this may be a 32 or 33 millimeter fish. When are they ready to breed? Not 90 days. Whenever they look like they're ready to breed. Females look gravid when they're gravid. And then they're ready to breed. And that could be 60 days, it could be 40 days. And depending on your methodology, it could be even longer. Environmental enrichment, it's used in specific situations like low housing numbers, same-sex housing, spawning tanks and recovery tanks. Here is a video of a tank without any cover in it. And the next slide is a video of one that does have a plant in it. So the effect is really pretty tremendous. This is slide 92. There's only 2 more slides left. There's something in the front of the tank that is worth protecting. So that'll wrap it up for me. Thanks for letting me run half an hour over and sticking with me. I believe that this presentation will be available for anyone and everyone who's signed up to get. And I'm certainly happy to field any additional questions either now, or you're very welcome to email me at my email address here at WashU if you have any questions or would like any clarification.